A brief word about personality types, and we won't go into this. You can find all types of personality tests on the web, and I think we used one by John Trent and Gary Smalley, the Golden Retriever, Otter, Beaver, Lion. And and there's no magic to these personality tests, and you don't let your kids off the hook because he's an otter and doesn't know how to pay attention to details. But the thing it does, when Joe and I did a personality assessment of ourselves and each of our kids, what that did for us was minimize conflict, because I began to understand, because of their personality types, they are not going to respond to conflict. They're not going to respond to stimuli. They're not going to respond to disappointment in the same way that I necessarily will. So understanding their personality types helped me tremendously in preparing them to live life and be functional rather than dysfunctional adults. The second thing is spiritual gifts. And I love to talk about this in homeschooling circles because one of the greatest opportunities God gave me as a mom, I think, was to begin to observe my kids' spiritual gifts that emerged in the context of daily living. It didn't take me long to realize that my 6-year-old had the gift of evangelism, because he would, little boys in the neighborhood, as we were praying for the neighborhood, he would come in and share stories of sharing Jesus with me. I remember one time when Joe took Ty to work one night late, just to have Ty with him. He was 8 years old, and they were coming out of PMSC where Joe worked, and Ty ran back and asked the security guard, "Excuse me, sir, but are you a Christian?" And the man said, "Well, I go to church." And he said, "Well, that's not what I asked. I said, are you a Christian?" And the man later remarked to Joe what a changing point that had been in his life. And John's gift has always been theology and understanding and exhortation. And so John, when he was 4 and Ty was 6, they were on a hike together up Stone Mountain with my sister. Ty says to John, "John, look at that huge footprint. It's so huge. It must be God's." And John, who is 4, looks at Ty and says, "Ty, God is a spirit and hath not a body like man." And so, but you know, if you weren't with them, you couldn't observe them. And in a minute, I'm going to tie all that together into how they live their lives as adults and how important those things are. For us to give to the church well-developed, mature believers who know what their gifts are and how to exercise them. And what a powerful gift you were given as a mom to the Church of Jesus Christ. And then where we'll spend just the last few minutes before we tie it all together is talking about learning styles. Now, my oldest son is an auditory kinesthetic learner, which means he can't learn anything without talking and moving, both of which are unacceptable things in the classroom. But when I began as a new homeschooling mom, this is back in the 80s, 1984, the learning style craze had not hit yet. So I was at a bookstore one day, and I picked up this book. It was this little toy boutique, and they had the Brio train all set up that I couldn't afford to buy the boys. So they would go play with the train, and I would look at their books section. I picked up this book, Growing Up Learning. Now, let me back up and give you some history about why this book was just a godsend for me. I had to use a curriculum when we first started homeschooling because of our archaic homeschooling law in South Carolina that said every morning, have your kids plant their feet on the floor, their hands on the desk, and look you in the eye. Well, Ty had never done that a day in his life. But you know how sometimes you wake up as a homeschool mom and you think, okay, no more wimp in this house. Today I am large and in charge. You know, so it's like I blew my whistle and I got everybody downstairs. And the boys were sitting at their little school desk. I said, okay, today we're going to do this right. We hadn't been doing this right. We're going to do it right. Look at me. Keep your feet on the floor. Ty, don't color while I'm talking to you. And it was the most miserable day we'd ever had. Now, they did it. We were miserable. My son couldn't answer one question I asked him. Now, this was the son who got kicked out of story time at the public library because the librarian said, "Ty, honey, you can't be the only one asking me questions." So he's very interactive. We went back to our normal way of homeschooling. The sergeant mom left, who had visited that day, the substitute left, And so we're all happy again. But I never could understand what happened that day until I was in this toy store and picked up this book, Growing Up Learning. And this was not even a book about learning styles, which is more sophisticated, and you can find out a lot more about this in Deb Bell's book, Ultimate Guide to Homeschooling. But it's more sophisticated even than modalities, which is auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. And he makes the point in there that the auditory and kinesthetic learner, as I said earlier, can learn by hearing and doing. And if they have to stay still while they're learning, all of their energy is so focused on being still that they can't process mentally what's going on around them. Same thing with verbalizing. If the child can't verbalize, he or she can't learn. So I refer to that day as Independence Day in our homeschool, when Ty was finally free to be who God made him to be. So as we look at the bent of our children and we work in cooperation with the Holy Spirit to try to raise these kids for Christ's glory who will make a difference in the world, if we will look at their personality types, their spiritual gifts, their learning styles, all the way God has put them together, then you begin to see this emerge as adults. And so the end of the story is, for me, Ty is a very successful salesman today. Makes sense, people-oriented, gregarious, kinesthetic, auditory. His gift is still evangelism, makes sense in terms of his personality and the whole package of who God made him to be, and he's been very involved in Evangelism Explosion. John, who is always my theologian, exhorter, learning style, visual, Mom, give me that stack of books. If you'd leave me alone, I'd get a whole lot more done. Today, he's the lawyer and very involved in teaching Bible studies and also very evangelical in his outlook on people. And then Lizzie, who was at the tail end 7 years later after John, her spiritual gift were those of faith and leadership and speaking, and her interests were journalism and the performing arts. And I can see now as she's a producer in news how all those things have come together. But I'm convinced that God does that in our homes as we become students of our children and we figure out and work with God to see how He's put them together so we can encourage them in the race God has set before them and not necessarily what we want them to become.